She wore a borrowed dress to the most important night of her life. No jewels catching the light, no title announced at the door, no one turning their heads when she walked in, no one holding their breath, no one leaning over to whisper, "Who is she?" Nobody asked. Nobody cared. She was invisible in the way that only truly lonely people understand. The kind of invisible that isn't just about being unseen. It's about being looked at and still not mattering. It's about standing in a room full of people and feeling the specific, bone-deep chill of being utterly, completely alone. The dress was dove-gray silk, simple, soft, the kind of dress that didn't ask for attention, didn't demand anything from the room. It belonged to a maid named Sarah, a quiet woman with kind eyes and careful hands, who had pressed it herself that morning, smoothed every fold, and draped it over the back of a chair without saying much. Just looked at the girl standing barefoot on the cold stone floor, looked at the nothing she had to wear, and said, "Take it." Not out of obligation, not for anything in return, just because some people still carry that old rare thing in their chest. Mercy, the uncomplicated, no strings attached kind. So she wore it. She pulled it over her shoulders and she walked into that ballroom and she stood at the edge of everything. And God, what a room it was. Picture it. Floor-to-ceiling windows throwing gold light across marble floors that had been polished until they shimmered like standing water. Chandeliers dripping crystal, hundreds of candles alive and trembling, making the whole space breathe like something living. Women in gowns that cost more than most people earned in a year. Men in pressed dark suits, broad-shouldered, unhurried. The kind of men who had never once wondered if they belonged somewhere. Laughter, rising and falling like music. Silver trays moving through the crowd. Champagne catching the light like liquid fire. And at the edge of all of it, her, standing just inside the threshold, one hand resting lightly against the doorframe, as if she needed something solid to hold on to, as if without it, she might just dissolve into the air. Her chin was up, though. That part mattered. Because this girl, whatever she lacked, the title, the jewels, the name anyone would recognize, she had not lost that. She kept her chin up. It cost her something every single time, and she did it anyway. That quiet, stubborn refusal to fold, to shrink, to give the room the satisfaction of watching her disappear. But inside? Inside was a different story entirely. Inside, her heart was doing that thing it did when everything felt too large and too loud and too much all at once. That tight, breathless feeling behind the ribs. That voice, low and insistent, whispering what it always whispered in moments like this. "You don't belong here. You never did. Look at them. Now look at you." She was good at ignoring that voice. She'd had years of practice. She let her eyes move slowly across the room. She wasn't searching for anyone. Not really. She had no one to look for. That was the whole point. That was the shape of her life. She moved through it without anyone waiting, without anyone watching the door for her, without anyone's face lighting up when she finally arrived. She had made her peace with that. Or she told herself she had, which isn't exactly the same thing. But some nights it's close enough to get you through. She breathed in. She breathed out. She straightened the borrowed silk across her waist, and she thought, 1 hour. Just make it 1 hour and then you can go. She did not know. She could not have known. That somewhere across that gilded, glittering, golden room past the laughter and the champagne, and the women in their expensive gowns, a man stood very still. Not still the way someone stands when they're bored, or distracted, or waiting for a conversation to end. Still the way something powerful goes still right before it moves. The way the air goes quiet right before a storm tears through it. Controlled. Coiled. Absolutely focused. He had been in rooms like this before. Dozens of them. Hundreds, maybe. Ballrooms and banquets and grand halls across half the world. He had stood in all of them with that same unreadable expression, that same careful distance, and he had really looked at every face, every gathering. Every candle lit, music-filled, crowded room. Searching. For what, exactly? He had never been able to explain to anyone's satisfaction, not even his own. Just a knowing, deep and old and stubborn as bone, that there was something he hadn't found yet. Someone, a presence his body recognized as missing the way you recognize a sound you've been hearing your whole life has finally, suddenly stopped. He'd almost stopped believing it would happen. And then she walked in, and the room for him went completely, utterly silent. Not the silence of absence, the silence of arrival, the silence of something that has been on its way for a very long time. Finally reaching the place it was always meant to be. His chest did something he didn't have a word for. His eyes locked on her and did not move. Could not move. She was standing at the edge of the room in a simple gray dress with no jewels and no title, and no one watching for her. And she was the only real thing in the entire space. Everything else blurred. She was it. She was exactly her. And she had absolutely no idea he existed.
I had told myself I wouldn't feel anything tonight. That was the deal I made with myself on the walk over, with the cold air biting at my bare arms and the sound of the city falling away behind me. Don't feel it. Don't let it in. Smile if you have to. Breathe if you must. But do not under any circumstances let this room see the parts of you that are still bleeding. I was good at that, compartmentalizing, folding the soft, bruised pieces of myself into something small and tucking them somewhere they couldn't be reached. I had learned it young, the way children learn things they shouldn't have to out of pure survival, out of necessity, out of the simple, grinding reality that no one was coming to protect me, so I had better learn to protect myself. So I stood there against the cold stone pillar at the edge of the Thornwood ballroom, and I breathed, slowly, and I watched. The marble floors were polished to such a high shine they looked like water, like if you stepped too hard you might fall through. The chandeliers overhead were enormous, dripping crystal and honey-warm candlelight that made everything glow, made every face look warmer and softer and more beautiful than it probably deserved to. Gowns moved through the crowd like living color, deep sapphire and rich emerald and burgundy, so dark it was almost black women who wore their beauty like armor, effortlessly, without apology. Men who moved through spaces as though every room had been built specifically for them. And me, pressed against the stone like I was trying to become part of the wall. I kept my expression neutral. I was very practiced at neutral. It required a certain tension in the jaw, a certain careful blankness behind the eyes, a kind of internal bracing like holding a door shut against the wind. You don't let the strain show. You just hold. I was holding, and then Margot found me. Of course she did. She always did. That was her particular gift, the uncanny ability to locate the exact person in a room who most needed to be left alone, and then descend on them like something elegant and merciless. She appeared at my left side with a champagne flute raised and her lips already curled into that smile, the one that looked, from a distance, like warmth. Up close, it was something else entirely. Up close, it had teeth. She didn't say hello. She never wasted time on pleasantries with me. She just let her eyes travel down the length of my dress slowly, deliberately, the way you inspect something you already planned to dismiss, and then she looked back up at my face and she said it. Quietly, almost gently, like she was doing me a favor. Nobody wants you. 3 words. Just 3. And I want to tell you they didn't land. I want to tell you I stood there untouched, unmoved, sealed off and protected by all my years of practice. I want to give you the version where I looked her dead in the eye and felt nothing. But the truth is they hit something. They always did. Not because they were new, God. They were not new. I had heard versions of that sentence my entire life, in different mouths, different tones, different rooms, but because the cruelest things have a way of finding the exact same wound every single time, no matter how many layers you put over it, like they know exactly where you're soft, like they were made specifically for that spot. She held my gaze for just a beat longer than necessary, just long enough to make sure it had gone in. Then she turned, graceful as smoke, and disappeared back into the crowd. And I stood there. The music played on. The laughter rose and fell. Crystal clinked against crystal somewhere to my left, and a woman in emerald silk threw her head back and laughed at something a man in a dark jacket said, and the whole beautiful, indifferent room just kept moving, kept spinning, kept existing in that effortless way of things that have never once had to question whether they belonged. She was nothing to them. Not cruel, nothing, not even acknowledged, and rejected nothing, just nothing, the absence of relevance, the particular erasure of being in a room full of people and not registering, not landing, not mattering enough to be disliked even, just passed over, the way eyes pass over empty space. I pressed my back harder against the stone pillar, and I breathed through it. I breathed through the marble and the light, and Margot's 3 words and the borrowed silk and all of it. I locked my jaw. I kept my chin up. I did the thing I always did, the only thing I knew how to do, and I refused to fold. But my hands, which I had pressed flat against the stone behind me where no one could see them, were trembling. Across the room, something else entirely was happening. I didn't know it then. I couldn't have. But I know it now, and knowing it changes everything about that night, changes the shape of it, the meaning of it, the way I move through it in my memory. Because while I was standing against that wall, holding myself together with nothing but jaw tension and stubbornness and a prayer, he was unraveling. Not visibly. Never visibly. Men like Kale Thornwood did not unravel where anyone could see it. But underneath the pressed, dark jacket, and the careful, closed expression underneath the absolute stillness he wore like a second skin, something was wrong. Had been wrong for hours. For longer than hours. His wolf was pacing. That was the only way he would later be able to describe it. Like something beneath his skin had been moving in restless, agitated circles since he'd walked into his own family's ballroom, scanning the crowd with senses that extended far past ordinary sight. He could smell the champagne, the perfume, the candle wax. He could hear conversations happening 20 feet away with perfect, uncomfortable clarity. He could feel the body heat of every person in this room like a shift in the atmosphere around him. And something was missing. He didn't know what it was. That was the maddening part. He had stood in rooms like this exact room, with these exact chandeliers and this exact marble floor hundreds of times in his life. He had stood in ballrooms across 3 countries. He had attended every gathering, every formal dinner, every carefully orchestrated event his position required of him, and he had moved through all of them with the same controlled, contained, deeply private patience of a man waiting for something he could not name. His wolf had always been restless. He had made peace with that, accepted it as part of what he was, that low, persistent agitation, that sense of incompletion, like a note held too long, waiting to resolve into something. He had learned to breathe through it, to function around it, to stand still in public and let the world believe he was simply composed when in fact there was something ancient, an animal and endlessly searching, running circuits just beneath the surface. But tonight it was worse. Tonight it was almost unbearable. He had refused the 3rd introduction of the evening 15 minutes ago. The young woman had been beautiful, genuinely, objectively beautiful, gracious, well-spoken. Everything a room like this would consider appropriate. He had looked at her and felt absolutely nothing. Not dislike, not even disinterest exactly. Just nothing. An absence where something should have been. His wolf had gone so quiet at her approach it was almost an insult, and he had felt the absence of that pull like a door swinging shut. He made his excuses. He moved away. He positioned himself near the far edge of the room where he could breathe slightly easier, where the crowd thinned enough that the overlapping scents didn't press quite so heavily. He took a drink he didn't taste, and he stood very still, and he asked himself the question that had been circling for months now, quiet and persistent and increasingly difficult to ignore. Why does it feel incomplete? His jaw tightened. His wolf surged briefly, sharp and agitated, and he pressed it down gently, the way you press down on something that could hurt you if mishandled. Easy. Not yet. There's nothing here. Why does every room smell like the wrong room? He didn't know. He had stopped expecting to know. He had almost made peace with the possibility that whatever his wolf had been searching for did not exist, or existed somewhere beyond his reach, or had simply passed him by at some point without his knowing, the way important things sometimes do before you understand to look for them. And then the air shifted. It was subtle. It shouldn't have been noticeable in a room this large, with this many bodies and this much competing sensation. It shouldn't have cut through any of it, but it did. Something moved through the air near the east entrance and hit him like a sound, like a frequency pitched specifically for him, like a lock recognizing the shape of its key. His wolf stopped pacing, completely, instantaneously, as if every restless, searching, exhausted circuit suddenly went still, and then not still like absence, still like arrival. His eyes moved to the door, and there she was, gray silk, no jewels, back pressed against the stone like she was trying to take up less space in a room that had never invited her. Chin up anyway, something quiet and stubborn and unbearably real in her face. His chest did something he had no language for. His wolf, for the first time in memory, was not pacing. It was looking. And somewhere deep in the oldest part of him, in the place that existed long before reason or restraint or the careful, cultivated control of a man who had spent a lifetime managing what lived inside him, something recognized her. Not from memory, not from anything as simple as before, from knowing. From the bone-level, ancient, irrefutable knowing that says without explanation, without justification, without a single word of proof, there. Hair. Finally. I felt it before I saw him. That was the strangest part. That was the part I have turned over in my mind 1,000 times since, trying to find a rational explanation for it, trying to locate some ordinary, sensible reason for what happened in my body in that moment. And I never can. Because there was nothing rational about it, nothing sensible. It came from somewhere older than logic, older than language, older than anything I had a name for. It started as warmth. Not the warmth of the room, not the candlelight or the press of bodies or the heat rising from the marble floors. This was different. This was specific, directed, like a beam of something moving through the air and landing directly on my skin, raising every fine hair on my arms, traveling up the back of my neck in a slow, deliberate wave. I went still against the pillar. My breath caught. Not dramatically, not the kind of thing anyone around me would have noticed, just a small, involuntary pause, like my lungs momentarily forgot their function. And then there was the thread. I know how that sounds. I know it sounds like the kind of thing you'd dismiss, the kind of thing you'd hear and think she's being dramatic, she's projecting. She's telling herself a story to make the night mean something it didn't. I understand that instinct. I had that instinct myself, even as it was happening. But I can only tell you what I experienced, and what I experienced was a pulling, faint but undeniable. Like something had looped around my sternum and was drawing gently, steadily toward a fixed point somewhere across the room. Static in the air. The kind that precedes something. The kind that makes the atmosphere feel charged, changed. Like the molecular structure of everything around you has quietly rearranged itself while you weren't paying attention. I looked up. He was already watching me. And the world very briefly stopped being a place where I knew how things worked. He was standing on the far side of the ballroom, near the tall windows where the candlelight fell in long, warm columns, and he was completely, utterly still. Not the stillness of someone caught mid-thought, or someone pausing between conversations. This was deliberate stillness, intentional, the stillness of something that has chosen not to move, which is an entirely different thing from something that simply isn't moving. There is will in it. There is power in it. The kind of contained, coiled, absolute stillness that doesn't read as passive, it reads as restrained. He was tall, broad-shouldered in a way that the dark jacket he wore tried to contain and didn't quite manage. His face was angular, sharp-lined, the kind of face that photographers and painters would have argued over all strong jaw and high bone structure, and something in the set of his mouth that suggested he had not smiled easily or often in a very long time. There was a scar at his right temple, small, pale, slightly curved. The kind of scar that doesn't announce itself but that your eye finds anyway and then can't stop returning to. It didn't diminish him. Nothing about him looked diminished. It just made him real in a way that all his obvious power and presence somehow hadn't quite managed on their own. And around him, without anyone appearing to consciously do it, people bent. Not dramatically. Not in any way that would have looked deliberate to a casual observer. But I noticed it because I was watching, because I had been trained by years of invisibility to notice the way rooms respond to people. And what I saw was this. As men passed him, they inclined their heads, fractionally, automatically, the way you might acknowledge something large and undeniable without wanting to make a scene of it. Women who had been holding court over their own small circles angled their bodies slightly away, creating space around him without being asked, without looking directly at him. The crowd just accommodated him, adjusted to him, the way water adjusts to something dropped into it. Nobody commanded this. Nobody requested it. It simply happened. Because he was the kind of thing rooms make room for. I didn't bow. I didn't move at all. I stood exactly where I was against the cold stone pillar in my borrowed gray silk, and I looked straight back at him, and I honestly couldn't have told you why. It wasn't bravery exactly. It wasn't defiance. It was more like my body had forgotten the appropriate response. Like every trained instinct I had, every careful learned behavior about how to make myself small and unobtrusive and inoffensive had simply gone offline the moment my eyes met his, leaving me with nothing but the raw, unfiltered, slightly terrified act of just looking. He looked back, and then he started walking. My heart moved first. Before my mind caught up, before I had processed what was happening, my heart lurched forward in my chest like it had been pulled on a leash, like it recognized something my brain was still scrambling to categorize. The warmth intensified. The thread pulled tighter. He moved through the crowd and the crowd parted. 10 steps away. I should have moved. I should have dropped my gaze, turned away, found something else to look at, someone else to pretend to be talking to. That was the sensible thing. That was what you did when something that large and that focused started moving in your direction. You stepped aside. You made room. You remembered your place in the order of things and you behaved accordingly. I didn't move. 8 steps. My fingers pressed flat against the stone behind me. The marble was cold and solid, and I needed something real under my hands, because the rest of the room had started to feel slightly unreal. The music was still playing. I could hear it, but it had moved very far away, the way sound moves when your pulse gets loud enough to compete with it. 6 steps. His eyes hadn't left mine. Not once. Not to glance at the people stepping out of his way. Not to acknowledge the man who tried to intercept him with an outstretched hand and a greeting he simply walked past without breaking stride. He walked like a man who had decided something and was not interested in being interrupted mid-decision. There was something almost frightening about it. There was something else about it, too. Something I didn't have a word for yet. 5 steps. My breath was gone. I wasn't hyperventilating. Nothing that obvious, just shallow. Too shallow. My chest had contracted down to something tight and airless, and I was managing it one small sip at a time. 3. He was close enough now that I could see the exact shade of his eyes, and what I saw there undid something in me quietly. In the way important things come undone without sound, without drama, just a slow release of tension that you didn't know you were holding until it was gone. Because his eyes weren't cold the way everything else about his presence suggested they should be. They weren't flat or calculated or empty. They were searching. They were the eyes of someone who had been looking for a very long time, and had just, in this moment, stopped. 2 steps. 1. He stopped. The distance between us was close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating off him, could catch the edge of his scent, something deep and woodsy and clean, pine and dark earth, and something underneath that I had no reference point for, something that bypassed my nose entirely and spoke directly to some primitive, wordless part of me. The entire ballroom continued behind him. The music played. The chandeliers trembled. Somewhere to the left, Margot laughed at something, and the sound of it reached me from approximately another lifetime. He looked at me. Not past me. Not through me. Not the way everyone else in that room had looked at me all evening, which is to say, without truly seeing anything at all. He looked at me the way you look at something you've been trying to find in low light and have finally managed to bring into focus. Like I was the thing he'd been moving toward all night. Like I was the thing he'd been moving toward far longer than that. The silence between us was its own kind of sound. And then he spoke. One word. Just one. Quiet. Low. Certain in a way that made the hair rise all along my arms and the thread in my chest pull so taut it almost hurt. Not a question. Not a greeting. Not any of the polished, practiced social currency that everyone else in this room traded in. Just one word, dropped into the silence between us like a stone into deep water. You. And God help me, every single part of me answered. I should have said something clever. That was my first thought. In the half-second after that single word left his mouth and landed in the space between us, I should have something ready. Something sharp and self-possessed. Something that would make it clear I wasn't rattled, wasn't affected, wasn't standing here with my heart doing things I hadn't given it permission to do. I was good with words when I had time to prepare them, when I could arrange them carefully, the way you arrange things that are fragile, making sure nothing vulnerable was too close to the edge. But he had said you, and every prepared thing I had dissolved. So instead I lifted my chin. It was the only move I had left. The one thing I could still control in that moment, the angle of my jaw, the set of my shoulders, the particular quality of stillness I put into my expression that said, without saying anything, I am not intimidated. I am not undone. Whatever you think you just did to me, you didn't. It was, entirely, a lie. But it was a convincing one. I had practice. He studied me. Not rudely, there was nothing invasive about it. Nothing that felt like an intrusion, even though every rational part of me knew it should have. It felt more like attention. Real attention. The kind that most people perform without actually delivering. He was looking at me the way you look at something that genuinely interests you. Something you want to understand. And there was a patience in it. A willingness to wait. That was so unfamiliar. I almost didn't recognize it for what it was. Then he said, "What's your name?" And something in me resisted, automatically, reflexively. Because names are not nothing. Names are something you give to people who have earned the right to use them, people who will carry them carefully. And I had learned the hard way that not everyone deserved that. So I looked at him, this man who had crossed an entire ballroom in front of God and nobility and everyone, this man whose name everyone in that room knew and mine no one did, and I said, "Does it matter?" I don't know what I expected. Irritation, maybe. Or amusement, the patronizing kind, the kind that precedes a dismissal. Or nothing at all. I had long since stopped building expectations around the ways people responded to me, because expectations require a degree of hope, and hope had become expensive. What I did not expect was the thing that happened at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't quite a smile. I want to be precise about this because it matters. It was the movement that precedes a smile. The very beginning of one quickly reined in, as if he had caught himself, as if smiling was something he didn't do without deliberate permission, and he hadn't yet decided to grant it. But the movement was there, involuntary, real. "It matters to me," he said, low, even, absolutely certain, and the thread in my chest pulled. I breathed through it. I held his gaze, and I breathed through the pull and the warmth and the way his voice seemed to bypass the air entirely and arrive somewhere in the center of me. And I said nothing, because I didn't trust what might come out if I opened my mouth without thinking first. He didn't rush me. That was the thing. He just waited, like he had all the time in the world. Like this pillar, this corner, this precise sliver of ballroom that everyone else had overlooked all evening was exactly where he intended to be, and he had no interest in being anywhere else. "You've been standing here alone for 20 minutes, he said. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't pity. It was stated the way someone states something they observed because they were paying attention. Full stop. Matter of fact, clear-eyed. My jaw tightened slightly. I was watching the room. "You were," he agreed. And then quieter. I was watching you. The admission landed without apology. No performance behind it. No attempt to make it charming or disarming. Just the truth, offered plainly, by a man who seemed to have no particular interest in pretending otherwise. There was something almost disorienting about that level of directness. I was accustomed to subtext, to things said sideways and taken back and wrapped in enough social dressing that you could never quite hold anyone to them. This was nothing like that. Enough social dressing that you could never quite hold anyone to them. This was nothing like that. You saw the woman, I said carefully, what she said to me. It wasn't a question. I already knew the answer. I could see it in his face, not in any dramatic shift of expression, because his expression remained largely composed, but in something underneath it, something that had hardened, some quality of stillness that had changed its character, gone from patient to contained in a way that was almost imperceptibly different and yet, somehow, completely distinct. Yes, he said. One syllable, but the weight behind it. And? I said. And you didn't cry. The simplicity of it hit me somewhere unexpected. Not because it was a compliment he didn't offer it as one, didn't wrap it in warmth or reassurance, didn't seem to be reaching for my gratitude. He just said it. Like it was simply what he had seen. Like it was the specific, particular thing that had mattered to him out of everything else in that room. You didn't cry. I had not cried. I had pressed my hands flat against cold stone, and I had locked my jaw, and I had held the door shut against everything Margot's 3 words had tried to let in, and I had not cried. And somewhere across that gilded, indifferent room a man had watched me do it, had seen me do it. Not the borrowed dress, not the absence of jewels, not the evidence of everything I didn't have. He had seen the thing I was doing underneath all of that, the holding, the refusing, the stubborn, quietly exhausting, deeply private act of staying upright when everything in the room was designed to remind you that you weren't supposed to be there. He had seen me. I didn't know what to do with that. I genuinely did not know what to do with it. I felt something shift in my chest, something that had been braced against pressure for so long it had forgotten how to simply exist without tension, and the shifting felt dangerous. Felt like the beginning of something I wouldn't be able to take back. I looked away, just briefly, just long enough to collect myself, to press everything back down into the neat, manageable arrangement I needed it in. Then I looked back. Don't do that, I said. Do what? Make it something. It wasn't anything. It was just a woman being unkind and me not giving her the satisfaction. I kept my voice level. It happens. It doesn't require witnessing. Maybe not, he said. But it deserved better than happening in the first place. Something moved through me at that. Something I pressed down immediately, firmly, with both hands, because I could not afford to let it move freely. I had learned the cost of letting things move freely inside me. I had learned it in rooms not entirely unlike this one, in moments not entirely unlike this one, and the tuition had been expensive. I said nothing. He shifted his weight slightly, and the movement brought him fractionally closer, not aggressively, not in any way that crowded the air between us, just closer. And the warmth intensified with the distance closing, the static in the air rising by degrees, and some animal part of me that I didn't fully understand registered his proximity the way you register a change in barometric pressure, in the body first, before the brain. Then he did something I had not anticipated. He extended his hand, palm up, open, the gesture of someone offering, not taking, and he waited. The room behind him continued to exist. The music played. The chandeliers cast their honey light across all that polished marble, and all those jeweled gowns, and all those people who had not once looked in my direction all evening. None of it was relevant anymore. Dance with me, he said. And before I could answer, before I could build the refusal I was already constructing, brick by careful brick, he said something else. And I'm asking. A pause. Brief. Deliberate. Not commanding. The distinction mattered. I felt it matter. In my chest, in the place where the thread had been pulling steadily all evening, I felt it land with the weight of something that understood exactly what it was doing. Because men in his position, men with his name, his presence, his particular gravity did not generally ask. They assumed, they expected. The world had organized itself around those expectations for long enough that most people would have called it simply the natural order of things. He had asked. He was still waiting. His hand was still open. And the thread, that strange, inexplicable, terrifying thread, was pulled so taut now that refusing felt less like a choice and more like a physical impossibility, like trying to walk away from my own heartbeat. I looked at his hand for a long moment. I looked at the scar at his temple. I looked at the careful patience in his face, the particular quality of stillness that was not absence but presence, not emptiness but restraint, all that power gathered and held and offered without condition. I thought about Sarah's gray silk, about Margot's 3 words, about 20 minutes pressed against a cold stone pillar in a room that had not once acknowledged I existed. And then I placed my hand in his. The contact was, I don't have a word that is accurate without sounding like something it wasn't, something feverish or impossible. But the moment our palms met, a warmth moved through me that started at the point of contact and traveled up my arm and into my chest and settled somewhere in the center of me with an exhale that felt like the end of a long, long wait. The golden thread went taut, and somewhere deep and wordless and entirely beyond my control, something in me said, "Oh, there you are." He led me out of the ballroom and I let him. That was the part that surprised me most. Later, when I had time to examine it, not what happened in the garden, not what he said, not what he showed me. The part that surprised me most was how easily I went, how naturally my hand stayed in his as he moved through the crowd, how the crowd itself seemed to understand without being told that the space ahead of him needed to clear, and how none of it felt like being pulled. It felt like moving in the direction I had already been leaning without knowing it. Nobody stopped us. Nobody said anything. A few eyes tracked us, I felt them. The way you feel eyes on your back. That particular prickling awareness, and I caught one face in particular. Margot's. Frozen mid-sip with her champagne raised, and her expression doing something complicated and unsatisfying that I filed away and did not let myself enjoy, because enjoying it would have required energy I was directing elsewhere. Then the doors to the garden were in front of us, and he pushed them open and the night came in. Cold, clean air, the specific relief of it after the overheated press of the ballroom. The music faded behind us, not disappearing entirely, but softening, becoming something ambient and distant, the sound of another world. The garden was quiet. Not empty, there were other people further along the paths. I could hear the low murmur of conversation somewhere beyond a hedge, but where we stopped, near a stone fountain at the center of a wide, circular clearing, it felt private. It felt like its own contained atmosphere. Moonlight fell across the water in the fountain in long pale ribbons, moving with the surface. Jasmine climbed the stone wall to the left in dense, fragrant ropes, and the smell of it reached me like something I hadn't known I needed. Soft, undeniably real. He released my hand. The absence of contact was notable, a drop in temperature that had nothing to do with the night air. I curled my fingers slightly, involuntarily, and then made myself stop, made my hand go still and open at my side. I looked at the fountain, then at him. He was watching the water. There was something different about him out here. The ballroom version of him had been composed in the way of men who are always performing composure for an audience, even when they're not consciously aware of doing it. Out here, with the jasmine and the moonlight and no crowd pressing in from all sides, that particular quality fell away. He looked not softer, that wasn't the right word, more honest. Like a layer of necessary translation had dropped, and what remained was just him, the actual shape of him, without the social scaffolding. I don't know why that made him harder to look at rather than easier. He turned, found me already watching him. Neither of us looked away. "Why?" I said. He waited. "Why me?" I pressed, and I was proud of how steady my voice was, how it didn't catch or waver, how it delivered the question with the bluntness it deserved. Out of everyone in that room, every woman in there who would have given you their name without you having to ask, who would have been exactly what that room expected you to choose, why did you walk across it toward me? The fountain moved between us. The jasmine breathed. "I'm nobody," I said. I said it plainly. Not self-pityingly. I was long past the particular flavor of pain that goes soft at the edges and asks to be contradicted. I said it as a fact, the way you state coordinates before you begin a journey, so everyone understands the starting point. This is where I am. This is what I am working with. Nobody. No name that opens doors. No blood that grants access. No title. No inheritance. No claim on anything in that world except the borrowed dress on my back and the stubbornness in my jaw, and whatever small, unremarkable thing I was made of that had gotten me this far. Knew a body. He let the word exist for a moment, didn't rush past it, didn't reach to smooth it over the way people do when honesty makes them uncomfortable. He just let it be what it was, and that restraint, that particular refusal to flinch, made something in me go very still. Then he said, "You're everything. Not performed, not decorated, not the kind of thing men say when they want something from you and have calculated the right words to get it." He said it the way you state something you have known for a while and are only now finding the occasion to say aloud. Quiet. Absolute. The certainty of someone who has already done all the wrestling with a thing and arrived, long before this moment, at the answer. I opened my mouth. Closed it. "You don't know me," I said finally. "No," he said. "Not yet." And then, "But I've been looking for you." The fountain moved. The jasmine moved. Something in my chest moved with it. "That doesn't make sense," I said, but my voice had lost some of its evenness, dropped somewhere slightly softer than I had intended, and I hated that it had. He was quiet for a moment, like he was deciding something, like he was weighing not the words themselves but the right way to offer them, the right amount of space to leave around the truth so it could be received without doing damage. "Every ball," he said at last. "Every treaty dinner. Every formal appearance I've attended in the last 4 years. Every gathering that my position required me to walk into and stand through and engage in without showing how much of my attention was directed somewhere else entirely." He paused. I was looking. Every time. In every room. I stared at him. "For years," he said. Like it was simple. Like it wasn't the single most disorienting sentence anyone had ever said to me. "That's," I started. "Not impulsive," he said. "I know what it sounds like. I know how it arrives. But I need you to understand the difference between a man who walks across a room because something caught his eye for a moment, and a man who has been searching for the specific gravity of a person he had no face for yet." He looked at me directly. "I have been looking for the shape of someone for a very long time, and tonight every restless, searching part of me went quiet when you walked through that door. The silence after that was very large. I stood inside it and tried to locate my footing and couldn't entirely. Because the thing about truth, real truth, the kind delivered without ornamentation or agenda, it doesn't ask you to respond immediately. It just sits there, patient and immovable, and waits for you to decide what to do with it. And I didn't know what to do with this. I didn't have a file for it, didn't have a framework. I didn't have any of the careful, practiced responses I used to manage unexpected things because this was so far outside anything I had prepared for that all my preparations were simply useless. He had been searching. Years of rooms, years of gatherings he walked through with half his attention directed at something he couldn't name. Years of looking and not finding, and going home to whatever version of stillness a man like him went home to, and coming back again the next time because the looking hadn't stopped. And tonight it had stopped. With me. I pressed my hand against the stone edge of the fountain, needing the cold solidity of it. The moonlight moved across the water. The jasmine smell was almost overwhelming now, lush and close and sweet. And I wondered distantly if this was what it felt like to be inside a dream, that particular quality of heightened reality. Everything too vivid, too present, the senses engaged past their usual threshold. Then I saw it. I hadn't noticed it before. In the ballroom, the light had been warm and diffuse, and I hadn't been looking at his hands, had been too focused on his face, on managing my own reactions. But out here in the moonlight, with the cool, clear illumination that left nothing softened or gilded, I saw the ring on his right hand. Dark metal. Antique. the kind of weight to it that you could sense even across distance. And the crest on it I had to look twice, had to let my eyes adjust, had to make sure I was seeing what I thought I was seeing. A wolf, crowned with thorns. The symbol was not subtle if you knew what you were looking at, and I knew. God help me, I knew. It lived in a specific, quiet part of my education, the part devoted to things you learned not because you would ever use them, but because the world expected you to know them. The way it expects you to know which fork is for which course, and how to address a letter to someone with a title, certain symbols, certain houses, certain crests that carried more history and more weight and more consequence than any single piece of jewelry had the right to carry. Wolf crowned with thorns, Alpha King. My breath left my body. Not dramatically, not in a gasp or a stumble, just quietly, carefully, like something that understood it needed to exit without making a scene. I took one step back, then another. The cold stone of the fountain pressed against the back of my leg, and I stopped because there was nowhere else to go. He saw it happen. Of course he saw it, those eyes that had watched me for 20 minutes across a ballroom from a distance, those eyes that had seen Margot's cruelty, and my refusal to fold, and apparently 100 other things I hadn't known were visible. He saw the recognition move through me, and he went very still. "You're Kale Venthus," I said. My voice came out different, stripped of something. The evenness was still there, but it had changed character, become the evenness of shock rather than composure, which are entirely different things wearing the same face. He didn't deny it, didn't reach for softening or explanation or any of the buffer a lesser man might have instinctively created between the name and what it meant. He just absorbed it, stood inside the weight of his own name, the way men stand inside things they have long since come to terms with, for better and worse. "Yes," he said. One syllable, the same certainty as before, not ashamed, not apologetic, not performing. The silence stretched. And then his voice shifted, fractionally, almost imperceptibly. But I caught it, that slight change in texture, the thing underneath the composure, that the composure was working very hard to contain. Something that in anyone else I might have called vulnerability, and that in him I wasn't sure had a name yet. Does that change things? 3 words. Quiet, flat on the surface. Underneath, not flat at all. Underneath, in the grain of those 3 words, in the specific quality of the silence he left around them, a man who had offered something real, something he didn't offer casually or often, something that had cost him the crossing of a ballroom and 4 years of searching and the careful, deliberate act of asking when he could have commanded, and who was now, in this moonlit garden with jasmine in the air and a fountain catching light between them, holding his breath, waiting. Not for permission, not for validation, for truth. The Alpha King, standing in the dark, stripped of every layer the ballroom required of him, asking a girl in a borrowed dress whether the weight of his name had undone the thing that had been building between them. I looked at the ring, at the crest, at the wolf crowned with thorns, ancient and heavy, and carrying every implication I had ever been taught it carried. Then I looked at his face, at the scar at his temple, at the careful stillness, at the thing underneath the stillness that was not certainty at all but something far older and far more fragile than certainty, something that had been patient for a very long time and was asking, quietly, whether it had been right to be. The thread in my chest pulled. I breathed, and I did not answer him yet, not because I didn't know, but because some answers deserve more than a moment, deserve to be looked at fully before they're given, deserve the weight of the silence around them so they arrive as what they are, rather than as something hasty. So I stood there in the garden in the moonlight in my borrowed gray silk, with jasmine breathing around us and the fountain moving between us and the name Kale Venthus sitting in the air like a stone dropped into still water, with the rings expanding outward in every direction. And I looked at him, and I thought, does it change things? And somewhere in the deepest, most honest, least manageable part of me, something answered before I gave it permission. No. God help me. No. We walked back in together. That was the first thing. The simple, loaded, irreversible fact of it that we walked back through those garden doors side by side, and anyone in that ballroom with eyes and half a brain understood immediately that something had changed in the 20 minutes since Kale Venthus had disappeared from his own family's event without explanation. The crowd registered it, the way crowds register shifts in power, not all at once, not with any single dramatic reaction, but in a ripple, a turning of heads, a drop in the ambient noise, a collective intake of breath so subtle it was more felt than heard. I felt it. I kept my chin up. It was the only thing I knew how to do, and I did it. Kept my shoulders back and my jaw set and my eyes forward, even though every nerve ending I had was firing at maximum capacity, and the warmth of his presence beside me was the only thing tethering me to any sense of equilibrium whatsoever. He didn't touch me as we walked, but he was close enough that I could feel the solid, steady heat of him, close enough that the thread between us had gone from pulling to simply present, constant, like a bass note underneath everything else. We made it perhaps 12 feet into the room. Then my father's voice found me across the crowd. I had always had a complicated relationship with that voice. When I was very small, it had been the sound of safety, the sound of someone larger than the world standing between me and everything that wanted to hurt me. Somewhere along the way, I couldn't have told you the exact moment. It happened in increments so small they were individually invisible. It had become something else. Something that arrived too loud and too sudden and carried in it the particular weight of a man performing authority rather than possessing it. The booming quality that isn't confidence but it's imitation. Saraphene. One word. But the shape of it, the way it cracked across the ballroom like something thrown, contained everything. The fury, the embarrassment, the specific outrage of a man who had arranged his world in a particular way and was watching a piece of it move without his permission. He was crossing the floor toward us. My mother was slightly behind him, which was her permanent position, not quite beside him, not quite separate, occupying that careful middle distance that had kept her safe for 30 years. Her face was doing what it always did when things went sideways, composing itself into an expression of pleasant vagueness, as though if she looked unconcerned for long enough, unconcerned would become the truth. She had spent a lifetime making that face work. It was working now, and the sight of it, that practiced performance of not seeing, landed somewhere in my chest with a dull, familiar ache. And then there was Margot. She was standing slightly to the left, and she was not performing anything. Her face had cracked, not fully, not into anything as honest as shock, but into something hairline and dangerous, something that was trying very hard to remain smooth and finding the structural integrity compromised. Her eyes moved between me and the man beside me and back to me again, and what lived in them now was not the calm, surgical contempt she had delivered in the corner an hour ago. What lived in them now was something rawer and less controlled, something that looked, underneath all the lacquer, very much like fear. Good. My father reached us first. He drew himself up to his full height. He was good at that, had always been good at the physical grammar of authority, the expanded chest and squared shoulders and lifted chin that said, "I am in charge here," regardless of whether the room agreed. He looked at me with an expression that had fury in the foreground and something else. Something complicated and quickly suppressed, somewhere deeper behind it. He opened his mouth. He didn't get to use it, because Kale moved. Not dramatically. Not in any way that was large or aggressive or physically threatening. He simply shifted, one step forward and slightly in front, putting himself between me and my father's oncoming energy with a precision that was so practiced it looked effortless. And his voice, when it came, was not raised. That was the thing that made it land harder than shouting ever could. It was perfectly, absolutely level. "Lady Saraphene is mine." The room stopped. Not gradually, not in a ripple this time. All at once, like something had reached into the atmosphere of the ballroom and turned a dial from noise to silence in a single motion. The music faltered. I heard the exact moment the quartet lost the thread of what they were playing and let it go. Conversations dropped mid-sentence. Crystal stilled against crystal. Even the candlelight seemed to pause, seemed to hold, as if the chandeliers themselves understood that something was happening that required the full attention of every living thing in the space. My father's mouth closed. The silence was enormous. Kale let it exist for exactly long enough. Then he reached for me. His arm came around my waist, not grabbing, not pulling, not any of the thousand things that gesture could have been and in other circumstances would have been. It was firm and warm and utterly certain, the arm of someone who has made a decision and is not interested in revisiting it. But there was something in the quality of the contact that was not about ownership, not about display. It was about the body understanding, at a level beneath thought, that something needed to be protected and moving to protect it. The difference between a man marking territory and a man standing between something precious and anything that would diminish it. I felt it in the contact. I felt exactly what it was. This woman, Kale said, and his voice carried now, filled the ballroom the way his presence filled rooms not by force but by nature, the way light fills space, the way water fills its container, simply and completely and without apology, is my fated mate. A sound moved through the crowd, collective, involuntary. My future queen. The silence after that was a different kind of silence. The first silence had been shock. This one was something weightier. The silence of a room full of people processing the seismic shift of something that could not be taken back, something that had rearranged the landscape in a way that would require everyone present to recalibrate their understanding of how the world was ordered. I was trembling. I want to be honest about that. I was standing inside the warmth of his arm with my chin up and my face as composed as I could make it, and my entire body was trembling. Not from fear, or not only from fear, from the enormity of it, from the specific, overwhelming sensation of being claimed in a room that had spent the entire evening treating me as though I didn't exist, from the whiplash of it, from the fact that 20 minutes ago I had been pressed against a cold stone pillar with Margot's 3 words sitting in my chest like shrapnel, and now I was standing here, held by this man, while the room that had erased me reoriented itself around my existence. It was too large. I didn't have a container for it. I breathed. I stayed upright. I kept the trembling internal where it belonged. Then Margot's voice came through the silence like a blade. She's nothing. Flat. Hard. The last move of someone watching their position collapse and choosing attack over retreat because retreat requires an admission she would never make. She's half human. Gasps. Real ones. This time not the polite, managed sounds of a crowd performing the correct reaction, but the involuntary kind. The kind that come from the body before the social self can intercept them. Half human. In a room like this, in this world, with its hierarchies and its bloodlines and its ancient, carefully maintained architecture of who matters and how much those 2 words were designed to land as devastation, I felt the room shift again, felt the weight of all those eyes, felt the collective recalibration, the whispered questioning, the doors I could sense closing in real time. I kept my chin up, and then Kale laughed. It was not the laugh I expected. I had braced for anger, had felt it vibrating in the arm around my waist, the particular tension of a man holding himself in careful check, but what came out was not rage. It was warm, low, and underneath the warmth there was something that had teeth, something that said, "I have heard this argument and I find it insufficient and slightly amusing, and I will tell you exactly why." He looked at Margot. He let her look back. He gave her exactly the moment she needed to understand that she had his full attention before he answered. "I don't care," he said, "if she's half human." He let that breathe. Half fae, another breath. The room was a held collective inhale. Half storm. Then he turned away from Margot. Completely. Fully. With the absolute finality of a man removing someone from his field of relevant consideration, and he looked at me. Only me. He raised his hand, the one with the ring, the wolf crowned with thorns, the weight of everything he was and everything that came with it, and he cupped my face. In front of everyone. In front of my father and my mother and Margot, and the entire assembled gathering of the Thornwood Ball, he cupped my face in both hands, his thumbs against my jaw, gentle and certain and devastatingly tender. And he looked at me the way he had looked at me from across the ballroom. The way that saw everything. The way that hadn't flinched at the borrowed dress or the nobody, or the half-human or any of the other things the room had tried to make me into. "The bond does not care about blood," he said. "Quiet, just for me." Except the room was so completely silent that it reached every corner. "It cares about souls." The trembling in my body changed character. Became something different from shock, different from overwhelm, different from the particular trembling of someone bracing against something they're afraid of. It became the trembling of something released, something that had been held tightly for so long that when the pressure finally lifted, the body didn't immediately know how to exist without it. "Say yes," he said. Not commanding. Asking. Still asking. Always asking. I looked at him. I looked at the scar at his temple, and the careful certainty in his eyes, and the ring on his hand, and the arm around my waist that held me like I was worth holding carefully. I looked at the man who had crossed a ballroom and asked instead of taken and searched for years and laughed at Margot's best weapon like it was barely worth the energy of a response. I said yes, and then he kissed me, not softly, not tentatively, not the restrained, appropriate, public-facing gesture that the room might have expected from a man of his position in a space like this. He kissed me the way someone kisses something they have been looking for 4 years and have finally found with intention, with recognition, with a fierce and total presence that made the rest of the room fall away so completely that for a long, suspended moment there was nothing else. No ballroom, no chandeliers, no Margot, no father, no borrowed silk or thorned crown or weight of history. Just this, just him, just the thread in my chest pulling tight and then releasing, not breaking, resolving. The way a note held too long finally finds its chord. The kiss was claiming, but not of me, of us. And when we finally separated, when the room came back in around the edges, the gasps, the silence, the sound of something irreversible having happened in a space full of witnesses, I felt his forehead drop to mine, felt the warmth of his breath, felt the arm around my waist hold fractionally tighter, just for a moment, just briefly, the way you hold something you're relieved to finally be allowed to hold. I heard someone in the crowd begin to bow, then another, then the sound of it spreading through the room like something inevitable, like something that had always been going to happen and had simply been waiting for the moment to arrive. And against my forehead, barely audible, barely a sound at all, he exhaled, like a man who had finally, after a very long time, come home. 3 months. That's what it took for morning sunlight to stop feeling like something I needed to brace against. For most of my life, mornings had arrived with a particular quality of dread attached to them. Not dramatic dread, nothing as large or definable as that. Just a low, persistent heaviness that settled in before I was fully conscious, before I had opened my eyes or located myself in the day. The weight of what was waiting. The quiet inventory of everything that needed managing, everything that could go wrong, everything that required the careful expenditure of energy I was always slightly short of. Mornings had tasted like preparation for a long time. And then, gradually, so gradually I didn't notice it happening until it had already happened. They didn't anymore. I noticed it first on a Tuesday, unremarkably, without ceremony. I woke up, and the sunlight was coming through the tall windows of the east chamber in long, warm columns, falling across the pale stone floor in pieces, and my first thought was not about what the day required of me. My first thought was that the light was beautiful. Simple as that, unguarded as that. A thought with no armor around it, no anticipatory bracing, no secondary calculation underneath. Just the light is beautiful this morning. It alarmed me slightly, if I'm being truthful. I lay there examining it, this undefended thought, turning it over carefully the way you turn over something unfamiliar, looking for what it was hiding. Old habit, defense mechanism dressed up as discernment. There was nothing hiding. It was just the light. It was just beautiful. I was still working on letting things be what they were without searching them for traps. "You're awake." His voice came from my left, low and unhurried, carrying that particular quality it had in the mornings before he'd fully chosen to be present in the waking world, rougher at the edges, the composure not yet fully assembled, something underneath it that was closer to the unguarded version of him. The one I had come to understand lived beneath the composed public one, the one I was still learning the geography of, which was its own ongoing privilege. I turned my head. He was propped on one elbow, watching me, dark hair slightly disordered from sleep, the scar at his temple catching the light, the ring on his hand catching it too, the wolf crowned with thorns throwing a small shadow across the pillow. He looked unhurried and warm, and entirely unashamed of being caught exactly where he was, doing exactly what he was doing, which was watching me sleep. "How long?" I said. "Have you been doing that?" "A while." "That's creepy." The corner of his mouth moved. "It's romantic." "Kale, it's creepy." "It's romantic," he said again, with the absolute serenity of a man who has examined all available perspectives and found only one of them worth holding. "You looked peaceful. I didn't want to interrupt it." I looked at him for a moment. At the unashamed warmth of him in the morning light, at this man who commanded councils and moved through rooms like weather and had once laughed at Margot's best weapon, like it was barely worth the energy of a response, lying in the early light, watching me sleep, and calling it romantic, without a single flicker of self-consciousness. "You're impossible," I said. "You keep saying that, because it keeps being true." He almost smiled. Not quite. The almost smile, I had come to understand, was its own language, more honest than the full one somehow, more his. I turned back to the ceiling and breathed in the morning, and let it be what it was, unguarded, unarmored, beautiful. The palace had its own rhythms, and I had learned them the way you learn the habits of something large and living. Not all at once, not from a manual, but by existing inside them long enough that they began to feel like weather rather than architecture. The corridors had their early morning quiet, and their mid-morning purposefulness, and their late afternoon particular kind of directed energy. The council chamber had its formalities, its protocols, its careful choreography of who spoke when and to whom and in what register. I had walked into all of it with my chin up and my jaw set, and the full weight of 3 months of learning pressed behind my eyes like a library I was still cataloging. There was so much I hadn't known I didn't know. I had understood in the abstract what it meant that Kale was who he was. I had understood it intellectually, the way you understand things that haven't yet become real through lived experience. Alpha King, ancient bloodline, authority that extended across territories whose borders I had only ever seen on maps. Governance that required not just presence but constant, careful, exhausting negotiation between pacts, between factions, between the old laws and the new pressures and the endlessly complex human business of people trying to coexist without destroying each other. What I hadn't understood, not really, not until I was inside it, was how much of it was invisible, how much happened in a glance across a table. In the specific silence a king maintained, while a lord made an argument he found insufficient. In the deliberate choosing of when to speak, and when to let the room carry itself, and when to drop a single sentence into a negotiation like a stone into water, and then simply wait for the rings to spread. I watched him do it, day after day, in chambers and corridors and formal dinners and quiet post-meeting conversations that happened in doorways between one thing and the next. I watched and I learned, and I began to understand the shape of it. And somewhere in that learning, I began to find the shape of my own place inside it. It didn't announce itself. It didn't arrive with fanfare or formal declaration. It grew, the way things grow when they're in the right soil steadily, quietly, putting down roots before it put up anything visible. I noticed it first in small things, in the way I started reading documents with a different kind of attention, looking not just at what they said but at what they weren't saying, the spaces between the stated positions where the real friction lived. In the way I started asking questions in briefings that landed differently than I expected them to, that made people pause, reconsider, look at each other briefly before answering. In the way I started having answers of my own. The halflings came first. That was where it began. A report on my desk left there by Kale's chief of staff, a brisk, sharp-eyed woman named Calendra, who had regarded me with professional wariness for the first 6 weeks, and something closer to measured respect in the weeks since about the growing population of halflings in the capital. District. Half wolf, half human, half fae, half something else. People who didn't fit cleanly into any category the existing systems had been built to accommodate, and who consequently fell through the gaps in all of them. No pact claiming, no human institutional support, no legal standing that anyone had bothered to clearly define. I read the report twice. Then I read it a third time, slowly, with a cup of tea going cold at my elbow. Then I went and found Kale. He was in the East study, standing at the long table with 3 territorial maps spread open in front of him, and 2 advisors who had the specific look of men who had been arguing the same point at each other for slightly too long. He looked up when I came in, and this was the thing. The small, daily, quietly devastating thing that had not once stopped landing the way his face did something when he looked at me. Not performed, not social. Just a settling, a fractional easing of whatever the day had been accumulating in him, the same thing it had done in that garden and every day since. I put the report on the table in front of him. "We need a shelter system," I said. "Transitional housing, legal advocacy, a clear protocol for halfling classification that doesn't default to exclusion." The advisors looked at each other. Kale looked at the report, then at me. "How long have you been thinking about this?" "Since Tuesday," I said. The light was beautiful, and I had time to think. He almost smiled. Fully this time. Then he looked back at the report and said, "Tell me what you need." The education program came next, built quietly over 6 weeks with Calendra's grudging assistance and the passionate, exhaustive cooperation of a halfling schoolteacher named Odrin, who cried twice during our first meeting and apologized for it each time, and whom I told on the second occasion to please stop apologizing because I was about to cry too, and we had a great deal of work to do. The trade mediation framework came after that, born out of a particularly ugly territorial dispute between 2 border pacts that had reached the council table in a state of advanced mutual contempt. I had sat through 3 hours of increasingly circular argument, making notes, and then I had asked quietly, carefully, choosing the exact moment when the room was tired enough to hear something new, a question that reframed the entire dispute around a shared resource neither side had mentioned once. The room went silent. Then the older of the 2-pack representatives, a weathered man named Castor who had looked at me with barely disguised skepticism for the entirety of those 3 hours, said, 1 syllable, but the shape of it. Later, in the corridor outside the chamber, Kale fell into step beside me without saying anything. We walked the length of the corridor in silence. At the end of it, he said, "Castor hasn't said to anyone in a council chamber in 11 years. Is that good? It's extraordinary." I filed that away, quietly, without letting him see how much it mattered. But it was not all quiet corridors and progress reports, and the slow, satisfying business of building something. There was Lord Vane. He appeared in the council chamber on a gray Wednesday morning, which should have been sufficient warning about how the day would go. A territorial lord from the northern reaches, old blood, the kind of man who wore his lineage like a second set of clothes and expected rooms to rearrange themselves accordingly. He had looked at me once when I entered the chamber, and then looked away in the specific manner of someone choosing not to acknowledge a thing's existence as a strategy. He made it 40 minutes before he said it. It came wrapped, the way these things always come, not direct, never direct, always deniable. A reference to the council's evolving approach to matters. A comment about the importance of experience and precedent. And then, with his eyes directed carefully at the table rather than at me, the word that carried everything else inside it. Unconventional. The way he said it. The particular weight he gave it. Unconventional as in out of place. Unconventional as in insufficient. Unconventional as in all the things Margot had compressed into 3 words in a ballroom 3 months ago, redistributed into 1. I heard Kale go still. Not the usual stillness. Something different. Something that had a sound to it. almost a frequency below hearing, a vibration in the quality of the air. His hand was flat on the table. I watched his jaw set, watched something move through his eyes that was not composed and not patient, and was moving very quickly towards something it would not be easy to walk back from. The sound that came from his chest was low, a growl, brief, barely audible, barely, but in the silence of the council chamber, with 12 people seated around a table and the only sound the distant wind against the high windows, it was heard by everyone. I put my hand over his. He went still. Not the tense, loaded stillness of before. A different kind. The kind that recognizes contact and orients toward it. The way a compass orients toward north not because it's commanded to, but because that's simply what it does. The nature of what it is. I looked at Lord Vane. "My lord," I said, and my voice was entirely level, entirely clear, carrying nothing that could be characterized as aggression or emotion, or anything that would give him the satisfaction of reaction. "I wonder if you might share with the council which aspects of the Halfling integration proposal you find unconventional, specifically, so we can address your concerns directly rather than generally." Silence. Lord Vane opened his mouth. "Because," I continued, before he had the chance to use it, "the data from the transitional housing program's first month suggests a 40% reduction in resource strain on the capital district's existing infrastructure. And the education initiative has attracted 3 territorial co-sponsors in as many weeks. If those outcomes strike the council as unconventional, I'd like to understand what conventional looks like, so we can perhaps aim for something better than it." The silence after that was a different shape from the one before it. "Across the table," Oldcaster said quietly, to no one in particular HM. Lord Vane said nothing. Beneath my hand, Kale's had turned over. His fingers closed around mine. Not tightly, gently. The way you hold something you're grateful for. Something you're relieved by. Something you're proud of in a way that doesn't require announcing. He didn't look at me. He was looking at the table, at the documents, at the business of the room resuming around us as it always did. But his thumb moved once across the back of my hand. Just once. Small. Certain. And I understood what it meant because I had learned his language. The one he spoke beneath the composed and the deliberate and the public-facing. The one made of small, precise gestures and the quality of silences, and the angle of a jaw and the pressure of a hand. It meant, "There she is." It meant, "That's her." It meant exactly what his eyes had meant in that ballroom, across all that distance, before any of this had existed. It meant her. Mine. Still. Always. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning in early spring. I knew the handwriting before I turned it over. There are certain things you recognize without wanting to, certain fonts of memory burned in deep enough that they bypass conscious processing entirely and land straight in the body. The particular slant of those letters, the slightly aggressive forward lean of them, the way the ink pressed harder than necessary on every downstroke as though the hand behind it was always, always making a point. I had seen that handwriting on social invitations I wasn't meant to receive, and seating charts I was meant to understand, and small, precisely folded notes left in places I would find them that said nothing terrible directly, and everything terrible in the spaces between. I stood in the corridor outside the morning room with the letter in my hand, and I breathed for a moment before I decided what to do with it. Then I took it to the garden. It seemed right, somehow. The garden had become mine in these 3 months, the way few spaces had ever truly become mine, not by formal assignment, not because anyone had declared it, but through the quiet accumulation of mornings spent inside it. Early walks before the palace found its full rhythm. Late evenings when the day had been long, and I needed somewhere to put down everything it had required of me. The fountain still ran, catching light differently depending on the hour, and the jasmine had spread further along the stone wall since autumn, thickening, putting out new growth with the specific quiet confidence of something that knows it belongs where it is. I sat on the bench nearest the water. I looked at the envelope for another moment. Then I opened it. Margot's handwriting filled both sides of a single page. The letters were the same, that forward lean, that pressed-in ink, but something in the overall quality of them was different, less controlled. the lines not quite as even as they usually were, the margins slightly inconsistent in the way of someone who began writing before they had fully decided what they were going to say, and kept going anyway because stopping would have been harder. I read it slowly. I didn't rush it. I gave every line the time it asked for. She began formally. Of course she did. Formality was Margot's first language, the one she defaulted to under pressure the way others default to silence or noise. She addressed me by my full title, which had a quality to it I couldn't quite categorize, something between respect and distance, the two of them occupying the same syllables uneasily. And then, across the course of a page, the formality slowly gave way. She had been jealous. That was the plain center of it, arrived at through several careful approaches and one or two retreats before she finally committed to saying it directly. Jealous since we were girls, since before either of us had language for what jealousy was or did to a person from the inside out. She had wanted what I had, she was imprecise about what, exactly, which told me she didn't fully know herself. Something about the way I moved through difficulty. Something about an interior quality she had tried to name and hadn't managed. Something she had recognized in me, and then spent years trying to diminish because diminishing felt more possible than acquiring. She wrote, "I thought if I made you smaller, I would feel larger. I understand now that it doesn't work that way." She wrote, "I am not asking you to forgive me. I am telling you that I know what I did, and I know what it cost you. And I am telling you because I think you deserve to hear it from me directly rather than carry it alone." She did not ask for a response. She signed her name without her title for the first time in any correspondence I had ever received from her. Just Margot. 2 syllables. Nothing attached. I finished reading. I folded the letter along its original creases carefully, precisely. The way you handle something that required effort to create and deserves equivalent effort in its handling. I set it on my knee. I looked at the fountain. The jasmine breathed in the slight morning breeze. Somewhere in the upper branches of the tree at the garden wall, a bird was conducting its business with cheerful indifference to everything happening below it. I waited for what I expected to come. The tears, maybe. Or the anger there was still material there for anger. Sufficient material. The kind that doesn't expire quickly. Or the complicated, uncomfortable softening that sometimes arrives when an enemy becomes human at an inconvenient moment, when the thing you built your guard against turns out to have been as frightened as you were the entire time, just expressing it outward rather than inward. I waited. What came instead was quiet. Not the quiet of suppression, not the particular held-breath quiet of keeping something down by force. A different kind. Spacious. Like a room after the furniture has been rearranged. More air in it than before. The proportions slightly altered in a way that lets you move more freely. I sat inside it. I had survived Margot's 3 words in a ballroom. I had survived the borrowed dress and the cold stone pillar, and the room that looked through me and all the rooms before that room. All the years of making myself small enough to be tolerated and strong enough not to shatter in both of those things simultaneously, which is an exhausting arithmetic that I had been performing for so long I had forgotten there might be an alternative. I had survived all of it. And then somewhere between a garden at midnight and a Thursday morning in early spring, I had stopped simply surviving it. Stopped carrying it as the primary fact of my existence, the organizing principle around which everything else arranged itself. Stopped defining the shape of myself by the outline of what had tried to diminish me. I looked at the letter on my knee. I thought about the girl in the borrowed dress at the edge of the ballroom. I thought about her hands pressed flat against the stone, trembling where no one could see them. I thought about the specific, lonely courage it had taken to keep her chin up in a room that had already decided she didn't matter, and I felt for her the way you feel for someone you used to be, and have since grown beyond, not with distance, not with the cool condescension of a rival looking back at departure, but with a particular tender ache. She had gotten me here. She had done that. Her stubbornness, her refusal, her exhausted and unglamorous and absolute insistence on remaining upright that had been the thing. Not the ball gown she didn't have or the title or any of it. Just that. I survived them, I thought. The thought arrived clearly, without bitterness, without the weight it would have carried 6 months ago, that compressed mix of pride and pain and grief that survival often carries when it hasn't yet had the chance to become something more than itself. But I don't belong to that survival anymore. That was the new thing. That was the thing I turned over slowly, feeling the shape of it. I had spent so long being someone who survived, had built my entire architecture around surviving, had developed skills and habits and reflexes all oriented toward getting through that, the notion of living, actually living, without the crisis management, without the bracing, without the constant low-level readiness for the next thing that was coming that had taken longer to arrive than I expected. But there it was. I didn't belong to that survival anymore. I heard him before I saw him. His footsteps on the garden path have a particular quality, unhurried, deliberate, the walk of someone who has decided where they're going and sees no reason to rush the arrival. I had learned to recognize it the way you learn to recognize the sound of someone you love moving through a shared space. A specific comfort in the familiarity of it. He came around the edge of the jasmine wall and found me on the bench. His eyes went to the letter on my knee immediately. He had the intelligence and the restraint not to say anything right away, just settled himself beside me, close enough that his arm was warm against mine, and waited. I appreciated that about him more than I had ever found the right words for. The waiting, the refusal to fill silence that was doing necessary work, the understanding that some moments needed to be arrived at rather than hurried toward. "It's from Margot," I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I know." I looked at him. Calendra mentioned a letter arrived from the Ashford house. He paused. I didn't ask what it said. I believed him, completely and without effort, which was its own kind of testament to 3 months of learning what his honesty looked like, the specific texture of it, the way it arrived without decoration or performance. I looked back at the fountain. "She apologized," I said. Another pause. Not uncomfortable, not impatient, just space. "Do you want me to respond?" he said. "On your behalf, officially, if you'd rather not." "No," I said it before he finished. Then I looked at him, at the careful attention in his face, at the readiness there to act, to protect, to stand between me and anything that still carried the capacity to wound, even from a distance, even in ink on folded paper. I looked at all of that and I felt the thread in my chest still there, always there, changed only in that it had stopped pulling and simply lived now, a permanent warm presence, and I said, "No, I want to live." I watched him take that in, watched his face do the thing it did when something I said landed somewhere real in him, that small, fractional shift, not dramatic, not performed, just the honest movement of a person receiving something that matters. He leaned forward, and he kissed my temple, soft. So soft. The way you treat something irreplaceable. Not a claiming kiss, not the fierce and intentional press of lips that had stopped a ballroom 3 months ago. This was its opposite and its equal. This was the private language of mornings and garden benches and bird sounds and folded letters. This was reverent in the way that word actually means, stripped of its formal trappings, full of awe. The awe of a man who has not stopped being grateful that she walked through a door in a borrowed dress and didn't look away. His lips stayed at my temple for a moment. I closed my eyes. The jasmine moved. The fountain ran. The bird in the upper branches continued its cheerful, indifferent business. And I sat in the garden in the early spring light, and I let the morning be what it was. Not a thing to survive. Just a morning. Mine. It happened on a Tuesday. Not a significant Tuesday, as far as the calendar was concerned. No ceremony scheduled, no council sitting, no formal occasion that would have framed it and given it the kind of context that makes things easier to understand in retrospect. Just an ordinary Tuesday in early spring, with the kind of mild, unremarkable weather that doesn't ask anything of you, and the palace going about its business in the usual way, staff moving through corridors, distant sounds of the kitchen, Calendra somewhere behind a closed door conducting what sounded like a thorough and efficient disagreement with a supply ledger. We were on the front steps. Not for any particular reason. We had been walking one of the quiet, unscheduled walks we had fallen into the habit of taking in the late afternoon when the day's formal requirements had been met and the evening hadn't yet made its demands. That particular window of time that belonged to neither and therefore, somehow, to us. We had come around the east wing and ended up at the wide stone steps that descended from the palace's main entrance to the long approach below, and we had stopped there without discussing stopping, the way you stop when a place feels like the right place to be for a moment. The light was doing something particular. Late afternoon light in early spring has a quality unlike any other season, softer than summer, warmer than it has any right to be given the air temperature, carrying in it the specific quality of something returning rather than arriving for the first time. It fell across the stone steps and across the approach below, and across the distant tree line, in long, golden, unhurried columns, and the whole landscape had that just exhaled feeling, that sense of the world letting out a breath it had been holding through the winter. I was watching the tree line. He was watching me. I had stopped noticing this as something remarkable, the watching. In the early weeks, it had made me self-conscious in a way I managed carefully. That feeling of being genuinely, attentively seen being so unfamiliar that my nervous system treated it as a threat requiring management. I had worked through that, had slowly, incrementally, learned to receive his attention without bracing against it, had come to understand that being seen by him was not a vulnerability to be managed but simply what it was between us, part of the texture of it, as ordinary and as extraordinary as morning light through tall windows. Saraphene. He said my name the way he always said it, like it was complete, like it didn't need anything attached to it, no qualifier, no softening, no context. Just the name itself, offered plainly, with the particular quality of attention behind it that made even the most ordinary moment feel held. I turned to look at him. He was looking at me with that expression, the one I had first seen across a ballroom, across all that distance and candlelight and crowded air, the one that saw everything, the one that didn't flinch. It was quieter now than it had been in that first moment, not because anything in it had diminished, but because it had settled. The searching quality it had carried then, the long-held tension of something seeking its resolution, was gone. What remained was simply presence. Full, unhurried, absolute presence. "I love you," he said. Simple. Completely simple. No decoration. No performance. No careful architecture of words designed to manage impact or create the right impression. Just those 3 words, dropped into the afternoon air like something that had been true for a long time, and was only now finding the right moment to be spoken aloud. Not because it hadn't existed before the words I knew it had felt it in 1,000 small, precise gestures and the quality of silences and the way a thumb moves across the back of a hand, but because some things deserve to be said. Because some truths are large enough to require language, require the specific, irreversible act of putting them into sound and letting them live in the air between 2 people. The golden thread in my chest, that thing that had pulled and tightened and resolved and lived quietly in me for 3 months now, went warm. Not explosive, not the fierce, disorienting heat of that first contact in a ballroom, just warm. The warmth of something that has been tended carefully and has grown into something steady. Something that doesn't require crisis to confirm its existence. The warmth of a fire that has moved past the urgent stage and found its rhythm, burning clean and even and long. I looked at him on those palace steps in the late afternoon light. I looked at the scar at his temple and the ring on his hand and the face that had become, in 3 months, one of the most familiar things in my world. Familiar in the way of things you never tire of, things that reveal new detail the longer you look at them. I looked at the man who had asked instead of commanded, and searched for years and laughed at the word, nothing like it was barely worth the air required to dismiss it. "I love you too," I said. Also simple. Also completely true. He exhaled, fractionally, the breath of someone releasing something they had been carrying, not from doubt I didn't think it had been doubt. Not exactly, but from the particular tension of waiting for something important to be mutual, to be confirmed, to exist in both directions simultaneously, which is the only direction love is actually itself rather than something else wearing its name. He leaned forward. His forehead came to mine. We stood there on the palace steps in the fading afternoon light, foreheads together, the space between us warm and close and entirely our own, and the golden thread between us was not pulling anymore. It was simply humming, low and steady and resonant, like the note a bell settles into after the strike. Not the strike itself, not the impact and the reverberation, but the sustained, quiet, living sound that comes after. That goes on. His breath was warm against my face. His hand came up, found my jaw, not to cup it the way he had in the ballroom, not with the fierce and intentional claiming of that moment, but differently, gently. The way you touch something you have been given responsibility for, and take that responsibility seriously. The way you touch something you are grateful for in a manner that goes beyond gratitude and doesn't yet have a word. You were never nobody, he said, quietly, against my forehead, just for me. I closed my eyes. You were never nothing. You were never invisible. You were never any of the things they needed you to be so they could feel larger. His voice was low and even, and carried in it the certainty I had come to understand was not performance, but simply what he was made of that. Bone deep, unmovable certainty of someone who has examined a thing from every angle and arrived at a conclusion they have no interest in revisiting. You were exactly yourself, in a borrowed dress, against a cold stone wall, with your hands trembling where no one could see them. You were exactly, completely yourself, and that was the thing. That was always the thing. I breathed. I didn't speak. There wasn't anything to say, not because the moment was too large for words, but because it was already full, already complete, the way certain things are complete, not because nothing could be added, but because nothing needs to be. The afternoon light moved across the stone. The tree line held its early spring green, new and tentative and full of the particular promise of things beginning. Somewhere in the palace behind us, ordinary life continued Calendra and her ledgers. The kitchen, the corridors, the ongoing and endless and deeply human business of people trying to do things well. And on the steps, with his forehead against mine and the golden thread humming between us and the spring air gentle around everything, I stood in my own life, not surviving it, not moving through it in preparation for the next thing that required management, not holding anything shut or keeping anything braced or performing any of the careful, exhausting work of existing as someone who expects to be diminished, just standing in it, in all of it. The governance and the council chamber and Calendra and Oldcaster's HM and the Halflings and the education program and the trade mediation and the morning light through tall windows and the jasmine and the fountain and the garden, bench and the letter I had read and put down, and let be what it was. All of it. Every piece of the life I had been building, quietly, steadily, one Tuesday at a time. Mine. Actually, completely, undeniably mine. And here is what I want you to know. Saraphene stood at the edge of a ballroom in a borrowed dress, and she did not know that she was the thing a king had been searching every room for. She did not know that the thread pulling quietly in her chest was real and ancient and entirely mutual. She did not know that the trembling in her hands, hidden against cold stone, was not weakness but the body's honest response to a life that had asked too much for too long of someone who gave it everything anyway. She stood there and she kept her chin up, and she did not cry and she did not fold and she did not make herself smaller than she already felt. She did not beg to be chosen. She did not perform for the room, did not dress herself in desperation or strategy or the particular kind of hope that exhausts itself making itself visible. She simply stood in what she had, which was herself, which was enough, which had always been enough even in the long years before anyone reflected that truth back to her. She wore borrowed silk, and she let destiny cross the room. Because here is the thing about people like her, the ones who have been told nobody and nothing and not enough in rooms that should have known better, they have been made, through no choice of their own, into something extraordinary. They have been put through a fire they didn't ask for, and they have come out the other side, not destroyed but refined, carrying in them a particular quality of knowing. A specific, hard-won understanding of what it costs to remain yourself when the world applies pressure, of what it means to keep your chin up not because it doesn't hurt, but because folding is not an option you're willing to take. That is not nothing. That was never nothing. You were never invisible, Saraphene. You were simply waiting for someone with eyes strong enough to find you across a crowded room. Someone patient enough to have been looking for years. Someone who understood, at a level beneath reason and above explanation, that what the room called nobody was the most singularly real person in it. You stood in your borrowed silk, and the king crossed the room, and the thread pulled taut, and the bond said what it always knew. Here, finally, home. Thank you for listening to another emotional, magical shifter romance here on Moonbound Romance Tales. If you enjoyed today's story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, so you never miss more powerful, heart-gripping romance stories.